Welcome to another special episode of the Boxing Lockdown, powered by SA Boxing Talk. We've got the two gentlemen with me, Hayden and Cyril, where we have a very, very special guest, another special guest, also from overseas. And this man has done wonders for the sport of boxing. He's done a lot for me in my career. He's a person that I call a best friend, person who's had my back for 12 years, and very special and close to my heart. And I'm going to make a prediction before I introduce to him who he is, actually, that one day he'll be in Canastota, the Hall of Fame. As a non-participant, although he is rather fit and big, I want to welcome the one and only Dixon. Tris, welcome to the Boxing Lockdown.
Thanks, Kai. I appreciate that. That's the best introduction I've had in my career.
Tris, you've written books, and well, let's just go back. When you and I met under a cloudy situation, you weren't then the chief editor of Boxing News. You were just obviously doing work for Boxing News at the time. And obviously, fast forward to now, you've written 4 books. You've written the Ricky Hatton book, which obviously did a lot for your career. But you pretty much have seen it all when it comes to boxing. You've done over 1,000 shows. You've seen and introduced and interviewed a lot of world-class and former fighters. You also work for BT Sports, which is quite a big thing. You've done some stuff on Sky as well. And I'm going to say, you're a legend. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the show, is because, you know, writers and reporters and journalists and guys who write books, they don't get enough respect and credit. And I think you have such a compelling story that I just had to get you on here, and obviously that the two guys also ask you questions. But let me just ask you this: like, where did it all start?
Oh, geez. Well, you know, in terms of the boxing dream, you know, I remember the Ben Eubank era, which was big on national TV over here in the UK in the early 90s, and I particularly remember the tragic fight between Nigel Benn and Gerald McClellan, which was on my brother's birthday. We went out for dinner that day, and I sort of made sure that the family rushed back so I could put the fight on. And so we watched that. And then, so I'd always had that interest. And then obviously there were the early Tyson fights, and I was captivated by those early Tyson fights. So late 80s, early 90s. And then, like, as a participant, you know, I was 16 years of age. I was playing rugby union, and one of my teammates, it was pre-season, they said, why don't you come to the boxing club to get fit? We started to go. So I went to the boxing club to get fit, and you know, within a couple of months, the coach said, "Do you want to spar?" And obviously, you're not going to say no, because it's because you're in a hyper masculine place where you can't show any weakness. So you say yes, sure, and then you spar, and then, you know, it becomes a regular thing. And then after a few months, a year, they say, "Do you want to fight?" And you're like, "Okay, same reasons. I really want to, but yeah, I can't say no." So you end up having an amateur fight, and then it just goes on from there. And I boxed for Salisbury City ABC and Truro ABC over here. I did a degree in journalism, and then I headed off to America to try and blend the two things, to try and blend journalism and boxing. And I remember I went over there with a business card that said Tris Dixon, boxing. It said boxer, boxing trainer, boxing writer. There was a couple of other things. I was like, everything. I was jack of all trades, master of none, but I was just desperate for a foot in the door. And I went to the Hall of Fame in Canastota, and then I slept rough. I slept homeless. Funny enough, on the last night, I bumped into a guy I traded VHS tapes with, who lived in Syracuse. So I met this guy, Boxing Bob Newman, who writes for Fight News. He let me stay at his place, and I sort of stayed at his place ever since for Hall of Fame weekends. But I'd gone there sort of homeless, no money in the pocket, and then I'd gone from Canastota to Catskill to train with Kevin Rooney, the great Kevin Rooney, who'd obviously been part of the Mike Tyson story. And I was in Catskill for a while, and I'd stayed there with a family of Italian immigrants who'd allowed me to work on their resort so I could stay there for free, or like a peppercorn rent. And then things were interesting with Kevin. Like, he had fighters coming through like Leonard Pierre, Jay Krupp, and Andrei Kopylov, a heavyweight who ended up fighting DeVarrell Williamson. And Leonard Pierre ended up fighting Kelly Pavlik and stuff down the line. So I was with all those guys for a few months. And then I'd met Matthew Saad Muhammad at the Hall of Fame. And he'd said, "Oh, if you get down to Atlantic City, I'll work with you." And things at Catskill had sort of seemed to come to a grind to a bit of a halt. So I thought, let's move on and get down to Atlantic City. And so I went down to Atlantic City, and then the next few months I was like between the gyms in New York, Philadelphia, Atlantic City, going on the buses, going around, going to Joe Frazier's, going to Gleason's, going all around Atlantic City and Pleasantville. The Klitschko's were in town to fight Ray Mercer at some point, so I was with the Klitschko's in the Powell gym. And then conversely, I was with Mercer in Pleasantville in a gym with Mercer, Al Cole, Kennedy McKinney, and Virgil Hill. So learning stuff and seeing stuff from loads of different good, experienced Americans and visiting fighters to Atlantic City. There also, while I was there, Brian Nielsen, the old heavyweight who was getting ready to fight Tyson, was in town with Thomas Damgard, who was getting ready to fight Arturo Gatti down the line. So there was loads of sort of big names floating around. And you know what boxing's like. It's quite, certainly it was then, it's a very welcoming environment. And if you're prepared to go and bleed and sweat alongside these people, they give you a foot in the door. And I just went and trained and worked alongside the guys and helped where I could, and did road work with them if they wanted to do it, held pads if they wanted me to. And I was just desperate for a break. In fact, I was that desperate for a break that Diane Fisher promoted a show, Tracy Patterson's last fight in Kahunaville in Delaware. And there was a women's fight, and I was the round card guy with my top off, walking around. I could do anything just to try and get a break, you know. I just wanted to be involved in boxing. And so I spent a couple of years coming between the UK and the US. The US, for me, was where Angelo Dundee was, Rooney, Frazier, Eddie Futch at the time, you know, Freddie was coming through. And that was kind of the place. Like, UK has a lot more big name trainers now with Joe Gallagher, Adam Booth, Mark Tibbs and so forth. It wasn't like that in 2000. All the big names are over in the States. And then it got to the point where I'd met Micky Ward at another Hall of Fame in Canastota, but a couple of years down the line. He'd just beaten Arturo Gatti, and I was at that first fight. And I said to Micky, if I come up to Lowell, can you teach me that left to the body? And he said, sure, come on up. We swapped numbers. Well, he gave me his number. And sure enough, I phoned him up a few weeks later, and he said, yeah, come on up. And then a friend of a friend, a mutual friend in the UK, had heard that I was going up to see Micky, who was obviously big news at the time. They got in touch with Boxing News, and Boxing News sent me an email saying, we hear you going up to see Micky Ward. Could you do an interview with him for us? And then literally that was the moment where my journey had some focus, and I became a writer, really. I know I was a journalist, and I'd done bits for different websites and bits and bobs, just again, trying to do anything I could. But that was the bit where the switch flipped. And instead of going to Micky to train, I went to Micky to interview him. And I was living in Atlantic City, took the bus up to Lowell. So stopping in New York, stopping in Boston, and then on to Lowell. And then I spent the day with Micky, and then I came back overnight in Atlantic City, got into the public library, because it's obviously very different now in terms of laptops and tech, and I didn't have any money at the time. So it was all on just an absolute budget. And I got into the public library, typed up this interview with Micky, sent it to Boxing News, and they said they really liked it. And they said, while you're over there, who else could you get? Well, I'd spent years over there by now, and I kind of was well plugged into a lot of people in American boxing. And I'd said, you know, well, around the gyms, I've seen people like Jimmy Young and Jeff Chandler, some of the old guys, and they were captivated by some of the old names that sort of that I'd met and encountered. And so the next phase of my career really was 2003 and 2004, where I would come in between the UK and the US, where I was working as a doorman in the UK to make money. And I would go out to America, buy a Greyhound bus pass for a month, travel around everywhere I could in a month, trying to meet these older guys who'd vanished and tell their stories, and then go back and write the stories all up. So I ended up taking Greyhounds. There was one trip where I went from New York to Vegas, and as far north as Toronto, and as far south as Miami. And I was going to old people's homes. I went and met James Scott in prison, went and saw George Chuvalo in Toronto, Florentina Fernandez in Miami, and everywhere in between. Cincinnati for Aaron Pryor, Chicago for Ernie Terrell. Loads of these guys have passed. But for basically 2 years on and off, I was going around America just trying to find these guys that had vanished to most people. And then came back from America. I know this is kind of long-winded, but that proved that I was willing to go the extra mile to get a story. And the Hampshire Chronicle, my local regional newspaper, hired me as a news reporter. and I would do serious news like hard news and court reporting. And I really cut my teeth as a reporter under those guys. And all the while I was still doing boxing stuff, but freelancing, because obviously I had the connections in America. So I was doing my work by the day at the newspaper and going home and getting on the phone to guys in America by night and interviewing those guys. And then it just snowballed from there.
That's quite a story. Speaking of all those great fighters, which would you say was the most memorable interview?
I touched upon that there with James Scott in prison. I mean, James Scott had been in prison for about 30 odd years. He was one of the great light heavyweights from the late 1970s, to the point where he had several fights in Rawway prison on HBO. They would send in the crew to the sports hall in the prison, and you can see these fights on YouTube now. And so to go and see James Scott, who'd spent so long in prison, and when I sent the request, I was freelancing, so I didn't really say that I was for any serious outlet. When I got the acceptance saying, yeah, you can come to prison, come and see him, like your appointment's tomorrow, I was like, wow, okay. But for me, it wasn't really necessarily about big names. It was about the cult heroes and the guys that have been forgotten. And I know that there would have been maybe more mileage in me finding Sugar Ray Leonard and Mike Tyson and stuff, but that wasn't my vibe. That wasn't what I was plugged into. It was about getting the random guys that just vanished.
Yeah, so Tris, you do a show on live on YouTube with Adam Booth, Counterpunch, Big Fight Analysis. I mean, it's sort of a new channel that you started this year. What sort of big fights are you looking to do going forward, or was it just the Deontay Wilder Tyson Fury fight?
No, we hope to do more big fights, and I'd like to do a lot more with Adam Booth. Like, we have a really good chemistry and a good understanding. Even through lockdown, we've sort of been casually in touch with one another. I'd like to even do fantasy fights where you're talking about Marciano versus Tyson and that kind of stuff with Adam, and break down the hypothetical matches. But no, hopefully the big fights. I suppose the only problem with Adam is we'd have to do fights where he doesn't have any kind of attachment to the fight. So people have been asking us to do Daniel Dubois and Joe Joyce, which was a big fight over here in April. And obviously Adam used to train Joe, so it's completely unfair to put him on the spot and say, look, this is a podcast where we're doing this. It's not fair on him. But something like a Canelo Billy Joe Saunders or Canelo Golovkin would be great. We'd love to do those.
Chris, you're a very deep thinker. You don't just pick up your laptop and start doing a piece. You don't just start writing. You're a very deep thinker. You're very sensitive to what you write and how you write. But you're also blatantly honest, and sometimes I'm sure you've pissed people off in the past. And that's okay, because your job's not to be liked or to be loved. It's to report what your eyes see and what your emotions tell you and what your brain tells you. What has been the saddest moment for you in your career thus far?
Are you talking about professional or everything?
Well, the private stuff, obviously, you and I have, that's why we're best friends. We've had each other's backs through ups and downs, and we've had some ups and downs in the last 12 years, the two of us. But I'm talking about purely from boxing. What, if you could say a few or a couple, what would be the saddest moments you've ever seen in your career?
There was a run towards the end of my time at Boxing News as the editor there. There was a run of, for a year or two really, where the sport just wasn't pulling itself together. It was infuriating. It was sad to see. And what I'm talking about is a load of failed drugs tests. I'm talking about Mayweather-Pacquiao not happening, despite it being the obvious fight. You know, by the time those guys fought, they should have boxed 3 times and had a trilogy. And then it would have been a far better contest had it happened back then. And then there was, you know, it started to feel like I was becoming an apologist for the sport. I remember covering Mayweather-Canelo in Vegas, and when they read out the scorecards that it was a majority decision, I don't think I'd score Canelo around. And I'm like, something's up here. Like, how can this be right? How can someone see this as even close? Like, it's not a tight fight. And like, I just thought instantly my heart sank. I was like, either I've had my eyes shut the entire time or something's up. Fortunately, the right man won, but just that scorecard was so out of kilter. And it just made me think, like, this sport, you know, it makes you question the sport and the integrity of the sport. And, ultimately, as much as we like to be these brave crusading people, we can't change it. I'd love to change the sport in loads of ways, and I'd love to give the power to people like Teddy Atlas and Margaret Goodman and Jim Lampley and stand-up people, but that's not going to happen. And we have to play with the cards we've got. And by the time I got to the end of that, I was kind of at my wit's end, and it forced me to have a little bit of a break from the sport. I definitely fallen out of love with it by then.
You mentioned that you fell out of love with the sport, but as you said, you came in the 2000s when the sport was still pretty much on a good run, but then there was a dip in the sport. Like, how difficult was it though, like, to fall out of love and now you're back in it now, to get back into it? What was the trigger?
That's a great question. So I think I was having this break, and I was just picking up different books, and I was reading this book called League of Denial, and it's about the NFL and the concussion crisis. And I was reading about this CTE, and which is what used to be punch drunk syndrome, and then dementia pugilistica. And I was reading this book, and page by page, I was like thinking, geez, this is boxing. Like, they're talking about the NFL and football, but I was like, this is boxing's problem. Like, how has no one cottoned on to this? And it was sort of a eureka moment to me. And that started the ball rolling, because I wanted to write a book about life after boxing for a while. I first wrote about depression in boxing in about 2009, because I seemed to meet a lot of people who were struggling with mental health. But before it became the big topic it's become, it was sort of it was something I was very proud to write at the time, because it was a pioneering piece, because it wasn't part of the conversation. And so I wanted to write about people struggling after boxing, but then I read about CTE and how that can really hinder people with depression and impulsivity and mood changes, and how it causes to the breakup of families and poor business decisions. And I was like, this has been going on in boxing for more than 100 years. And so I started to write a book called Damage off my own back, and just thinking, I wasn't thinking about necessarily getting it published, but I wanted to do this book and combine CTE with this life after boxing problem. And as I sort of dug deeper into it, it became an obsession. But I was having the conversation with a lot of fighters and trainers, and the relationship I had with fighters and trainers, it kind of pulled me back in, because I was back in the gyms. I was talking to the fighters and the trainers, and the fighters and the trainers are generally the guys that you'll get on best with, because they're so pure, because they're doing it for the love of the sport and not for the money. Like, those guys will start in boxing because they want to start boxing. They don't start thinking they're going to get rich. Do you understand? Like, when people go to the gym for the first time, it's a sporting pursuit. They want to do that. And so that really relit my fire and invigorated me to get back involved. So it was really writing Damage, which is now due out in March next year, that brought me back in. And that's been, for the last 4 years or so, I've been back in boxing. I will say, not to the extent as I was before, because my life priorities have changed. Now I'm 41 years old, and my kids are growing, and as a man, I don't want to miss certain things that you would miss by putting your work first. Perhaps I could have been accused of being a workaholic before, and now it's not a good accusation to have, where you put your job before the people that mean the most to you.
Yeah, Tris, so I wanted to ask you, I'm going to split two worlds for you. Writing, being a show anchor, video production. What is the sort of thing that gets you to tick? What do you enjoy the most out of all? I know you're an all-round journalist, but what do you enjoy the most?
So the writing's the safety net. The writing's my big thing, and that's kind of what I'm trained in. The good thing about the TV thing is I'm not trained in it at all. So it's like a big safety net goes. And I got to the point where I'd done a lot in boxing in terms of writing, and I've been a studio guest in different shows and all the rest of it. I was very comfortable with that. But as soon as you get the mic in front of you and you're introducing stuff, and you can't slip on your words, and you can't and ah and stuff like that, it's a whole different type of pressure. And it really took me out of my comfort zone. I was very pleased to get a new challenge at a time in my life where I thought, I'm just going to be writing and, maybe do the odd guest spot on TV and stuff. But writing's my go-to thing. And now I'm sort of planning my future, the books I want to write in the next few years and that kind of stuff.
First, I'm not sure if you'll remember this, but I've got a very good memory, as you know. It was 2012, and we were at the Wild Card, and I met you. I think we were having our first cup of coffee in the morning, and something had ticked you off. And you were staying at the Vagabond, and you said to me, Colin, I'm starting to write this book. I started writing it last night, called Why I Hate Boxing. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Yeah, yeah.
Now, I mean, it's all kind of, how everything's played out. But one question I want to ask you, have you ever been in an interview where you don't like the fighter and the fighter doesn't like you, but you got to do your job? Would you care to tell us who that fighter was, if there was, or could you tell us a moment like that?
John, I've been pretty lucky, to be honest, because I know that there are some guys who are temperamental. In fact, the last trip I did with BT was in January into February, and it was to do all the big interviews with Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder before their fights. And Tyson and Deontay can both be difficult. And then to throw it into the mix, I had to go to Los Angeles and do an interview with Mike Tyson too. So I was spinning a lot of different plates with very big personalities. And obviously, I think the worst thing is when a company's backed you to go and do the interviews, you obviously don't want to go back cap in hand or without anything decent. So you have that fear. Fortunately, I can't recall anything where it's been that bad. I mean, you get guys who are great talkers and you get guys who aren't so good. I had to phone Larry Holmes today, actually, for a piece that I'm doing on Mike Tyson for Ring Magazine. And, I said to Larry, I want to speak to you about Mike Tyson. The guy knocked him out in 4 rounds in 1987, 1988. And it's not something that he particularly probably wants to talk about when he's just enjoying his day. And so, there was a sort of air of reluctance in his voice when I said what I wanted to talk to him about. Funny enough, I just had a missed call from Michael Spinks. I've got to do the same thing with him shortly. but yeah, so that kind of stuff. But it's weird. Like, no, there are people out there who have these bad experiences, but I've been fortunate. And, I think it goes back a little bit to my own experiences in boxing. I think people respect the fact that I've come from boxing and respect that I'm around and still fit and still healthy, that I'm not a journalist who's going to slag them off for not making weight when I'm in shape myself, that I've got some experience, that I've boxed, I've been around the gyms. I generally, people do know that I've been around and had that experience. And I'm also at an age now where the older guys, I'm old enough to have a head on my shoulders, where the older guys have some respect for me. And I'm not too old to not be cool enough to speak to for the younger fighters coming through. Probably about another 5 years off from that. But so I'm just in a good place at the moment where I can happily speak to the younger guys and the older guys. Another 10 years, the young guys with all their TikToks and everything else will probably be done with me.
Okay. Chris, you mentioned that you were at the Micky Ward fight. That's a classic to you, the first fight. Obviously, that's a classic to most boxing fans. Most of us watched it on TV. What was it like? What was the atmosphere like at the venue watching a fight like that?
It's funny. It's one of those things where everyone's there for the same reason. Everyone kind of knew what kind of fireworks were going to be on. And it was one of those where even after the first round, strangers, because I was there as a fan, not as a journalist, because I thought there was going to be something magical there. And after the first round, strangers next to me were high-fiving each other, just thinking, wow, like we're going to see something special here. And it seemed like it wouldn't get any better than that. But round after round after round, people were just looking at each other in disbelief. And obviously through the peaks and troughs of the fight, people were on their chairs and then they were down and just roaring. It was an amazing occasion. I hadn't experienced anything really like that. Not live. It was a sensational thing to be at, for sure.
Tris, I want to go back to your safety net. You're writing, you got a book coming out next year, I believe, which is the brain trauma book. It's a big topic in boxing, obviously, controversially. So I'm not asking you to give away anything in the book, but I mean, how has it been like sort of writing that book and the experiences?
I found it quite therapeutic, to be honest. So I think by writing that book and addressing the subject has allowed me to stay in the sport. I think if I turned a blind eye and done nothing about it with the knowledge I've had, I wouldn't have an easy conscience staying in the sport and covering it the way that I do, and just, you know, ignoring that, pretending it doesn't exist. In terms of the interviews, you know, a long interview I did with Frankie Pryor, Aaron's widow, was a very telling one. And I went and spent a day with Leon and Brenda Spinks in Las Vegas, which was very sad. But I've also been to see all the Boston doctors, so Dr. Ann McKee, Chris Nowinski, and Dr. Robert Cantu, who've been behind a lot of the research in the NFL. Those guys are all interesting. So yeah, and you know, I spoke more than 100 on interviews. I spoke to George Foreman about his heavyweight contemporaries and Chuck Wepner and Ernie Shavers from that era, because a lot of those 70s heavyweights that we remember as a golden era, when you think of Ernie Terrell, Jimmy Young, Muhammad, Joe Frazier, George Chuvalo's now struggling, Ron Lyle, a lot of them had neurological deficits down the line. And will we see the same thing with Andy Murray, Roger Federer, and Rafael Nadal? I don't think we will.
So I want to go back to you having an emotional connection to a fighter, and we have to talk about Ricky Hatton. You were writing his book, and he made that comeback. And I remember you telling me the story like it was yesterday, where Ricky had just lost, and you were kind of sheepishly walking behind him back to his dressing room. And then you noticed that you were walking behind him, and he stopped, and he came up to you, and he put his arms around you, and he started crying, and he said, "I'm so sorry, Tris." What was that moment like when you obviously were doing the book for him, and you had that emotional connection to him because you spent all this time with him, knowing about his life story, about his career, all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes? What was that moment like for you?
Do you know, I thought that was quite, it was poignant. I think he was sorry because I think he thought that he was going to take everyone on this massive comeback where he fought the likes of Amir Khan and Kell Brook and became big news, and everyone was in for a big ride again. And I think it was the realization that it wasn't there anymore. For me, that was a relief. Because I didn't want him to fight on. He didn't have anything to prove. Although on that night, the loss to Senchenko, he proved everything that he needed to prove to himself, to sort of lose the interest in fighting again. But for me, that realization that it was over was a bit of a relief, because, you know, I knew that he'd scratched the itch and he'd found out. He didn't get the answer he wanted, but he got the answer. And so you could say mixed emotions, but the overwhelming one was we both knew it was over. And I for one thought it wasn't. It was a strange way to go out. You know, a guy who was famous for his body shots and famous for making the Manchester Arena his own, to go out to a body shot in the Manchester Arena. It was eerie. And when he was knocked down, the place went dead. You know, 20,000 people, you could have heard a pin drop. Very, very unique feeling. But I was satisfied for him, which is an odd way of looking at it. But, you know, we've seen fighters come back and get badly hurt, and, you know, thank God that didn't happen.
But how bad is it to see a fighter who you've built a bond with, and you see him, you don't think he should be coming back, but as you say, it was an itch that he needed to scratch. But how bad is it in the back of your mind, thinking this guy doesn't really need to do this, but he's determined to do this? How difficult is it for yourself?
So on a personal level, I stopped getting very close to fighters, really. I mean, Ricky was kind of unique because I was working on his book. But, you know, I've always been quite independent and quite impartial, and it's always been a bit of a live and let live thing. But now, knowing what I know about CTE and the damage and the long-term consequences of taking hits later on in your career, and certainly when you've already taken a few thousand up to that point, you know, if someone says to me they're thinking of coming back, you know, I'll just roll my eyes. You know, you can't tell people because they're not aware of the dangers, of the long-term dangers. And this is another reason behind the book. So many people in boxing think the dangers are about what happens on fight night and, you know, getting carried from the ring and worst case scenarios. and they're not aware that the damage can come. You might retire fine at 35 and you might be perfectly healthy, but at 50, 55, there's a neurological drop off that can happen. Doesn't always happen, but can happen, and does happen a lot.
Tris, you were a freelance journalist. I think you still are a freelance journalist. You're sort of the embodiment of someone that started at the bottom and sort of worked his way to the top without being backed by a sort of huge network like a lot of the journalists are. Can you give advice to sort of the younger guys that are looking to pursue maybe the exact same thing that you did?
Maintain your impartiality and integrity, because then you can sleep at night. I know a lot of people who've got a lot of good opportunities by jumping into bed with promoters and working with, and schmoozing with networks and stuff. I don't think that's necessarily the way forward. I think the best advice, so get your grounding in journalism. So try and get that, make that your education. Because I am asked this quite a lot. Try and make that your thing. Don't come at me after you've been a taxi driver for 20 years and say, I want to do what you do, because I went to university to do it. And then obviously paid a lot, 10 years of dues to get in there. The other thing is there are so many platforms now to write for, then start writing and get some work out there and try and improve and try and write for a site where there's an editor who can help you along the way, and try and help, someone who can critique your work and try and bring you on a little bit. In today's day and age, like when I was coming through, it was very much like who you know or what you could do, what can you do that's unique. And the best bit of advice I give now is to try and create your own niche. And my niche was finding the old guys, the old random guys that people couldn't find. And that sort of launched my career. But now so many people see what someone's doing and they just try to copy what someone else is already doing without trying to find their own path. If everyone does the same thing, then the floodgates open and it's just boring on every level. So what you need to do is find your niche and find something exclusive to you. And, I've done that. Hopefully people think that with my recent podcast that I've been doing, Boxing Life Stories, which is a long form sit down interview with someone about their journey through the sport. It's not, I haven't reinvented the wheel, but there was nothing out there doing what I'm doing.
First, your highlights and your lowlights of your boxing career.
Highlights, I just go to think of big fights I've been to, really, and been lucky to be at. So I think of Pacquiao Marquez 4, when this isn't a highlight, but I thought Marquez had killed Pacquiao because that was just, an amazing knockout. Froch Kessler fights, the number 1 in Denmark and number 2 over here, were both brilliant. Seeing the rise of David Haye was exciting, covering that. I've obviously covered a lot of Mayweather fights and he was majestic. I was at Hopkins Trinidad in the Garden. That was an amazing fight, an amazing night. Charged because it was in the aftermath of 9/11, just a couple of weeks after that. It was the first big fight back in New York. Those would be among the highlights. And the lowlights, again, really sort of touching upon people failing PED tests, the bad decisions and scorecards, which you just can't get your head around. And, it's easy to palm off in boxing and say, oh, it's all subjective. It's down to what you like and all the rest. It's not. Sometimes the scorecards are just dreadful.
And talking about the fighters, who would you rate as the top British boxer in your time as a journalist? The number 1 British pound for pound.
Oh God, good question. It has to be Joe Calzaghe. It has to be Joe. I mean, I was at his Kessler fights, or the Kessler fight in Wales. I covered it. I was at the Manfredo fight. He fought on the Brian Nielsen, Mike Tyson undercard in Copenhagen. I covered that fight. So I covered a lot of Joe. I was at the David Starry fight. I covered a lot of Joe, and he just always found a way, didn't he? And he always wasn't always impressive, but sometimes he went into fights when his back was against the wall. He had personal problems. His hands he fought a lifelong battle with bad hands. And yet he always found a way to win. And he has that style that makes you think he would be a handful for anyone on any given day at 168. He really would be. And then obviously he had those 2 big wins in America at the end, Hopkins and Jones. Hopkins was still very relevant and went on to have more big fights, and Roy was at the end, but still went on to have more fights. And And then I think Froch maybe gave me as much enjoyment as anybody else because he has been in so many terrific wars. The Boutte fight over here, both Kessler fights, as I mentioned. Glenn Johnson was a tough fight in Atlantic City I went to. So probably those guys, weirdly, because they're rivals. Again, I covered a lot of Khan fights, though, and Hatton fights. But Khan, I was at the Maidana fight in Vegas where there was just fireworks. And I've been privileged to have been at a lot of great fights with these guys.
I'm going to ask a question specifically for the audience that will probably be watching this as well. Do you have a favorite South African fighter at all? Is that something that you've been watching, South African boxing at all?
I mean, I've always watched South African boxing. I mean, the late Pete Muscati used to write for me at Boxing News. So, I mean, he always used to bring fighters to my attention. In fact, I've just got Stan Christodoulou's book to read in front of me as well. I followed Hecky since Colin and Hecky have been working together. I mean, it's hard to look beyond Brian Mitchell, the road warrior who had all those fights and did so much for the sport. And it's funny, you know, when you go to some places like the Hall of Fame, I don't know how appreciated Brian is in South Africa, but when you go to the Hall of Fame in New York and you see all these boxing buffs come out of the woodwork, they love people like Brian Mitchell and Ken Buchanan and people who haven't maybe had the credit they deserve, maybe at home or certainly from the wider public. But it's hard to look beyond Brian. I mean, that I might be grossly overlooking someone. And obviously Maruti as well now, and to see what he's doing and the respect he's getting, even late in his career, it's hard not to root for the guy because obviously everyone's hoping he gets this one big payoff and can sail off into the sunset. So yeah, I've always had a cursory eye on the South African scene. And you know, I've had a lot of respect for guys like Corey Sanders, who I've interviewed in the past. You know, it was tragic when we heard about his passing, and he had that violent shootout with Vitaly Klitschko as well when he fought for the heavyweight championship of the world. And his knockout reel is as sensational as anyone else's too.
First, let's move on to you in your personal life. You're engaged to Joe. You've got 2 beautiful kids. You're an amazing father. Let's talk about just what he does in his spare time besides lifting 250,000 pounds, 3 reps, maxing it out. What do you do in your spare time?
So, I mean, I kind of came up with this thing where a couple of years ago, I think, well, when I left Boxing News, really, I needed to work out, you know, approaching 40, what I wanted in my life. And I think there's 5 things if I need to get this right. I have my training where I do CrossFit. I have my dogs. I have 2 pugs and a French bulldog. I have my kids. I have Joe, and I have my work. And those are my 5 things. And say I have 5 test tubes. None of them could be 100% full because you can't put 100% into everything. I try and keep everything at about a 7 out of 10. And I think if I'm ticking all those boxes, I'm quite happy because obviously I love boxing. I love the sport. I love the role I have in the sport now. I worship my dogs. The kids, a little less so now, they're getting older. I worship I have to say I worship Jo because she'll be listening. And my training, obviously I need training for peace of mind, mental health and everything else that you get with that. And the fact that I want to be playing with my kids until they no longer want to use me or play with me. So that's kind of it. That's life. It's balancing that amount of stuff and also trying to harness my ambition because I can slip back into a workaholic mode quite quickly. So it's about reining that in and making sure that I take time out and put my headphones on or go out with the dogs or whatever.
All right. In terms, you mentioned you used to travel a lot, and nowadays you've got family, you've got all these other responsibilities. In terms of traveling, how much traveling do you do now with all the other responsibilities that you've got?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I'm kind of feast or famine. So like I'm either away for a couple of weeks and traveling everywhere and doing as much as I possibly can in a short space of time, or I'm home. And so generally I'm away sort of maybe 5 or 6 times a year for anything up to between 5 days and 2 weeks. I did 2 weeks at the end of America in America at the end of last year, where I covered Beterbiev, Dixon, Philadelphia, did a piece on Philadelphia and go around the old gyms and what the city's become. I went to Deer Lake in Pennsylvania to Muhammad Ali's old training camp. I went up to Boston and did interviews with the guys at the Brain Bank for the book. I went and saw Peter McNeely, Micky Ward and Teddy Atlas all for the podcast in Staten Island, in Lowell, and then wherever Peter was in Boston, Lawrence in Boston. And so in that 2-week period, I just flew around like a maniac doing everything. And then I came home and chilled out. And so that's kind of it. So I go away, but I don't stop when I go away now, so I can come back and enjoy the things. And then when I come back, going back to that test tube analogy where work would have been a 10 and everything else a 1 or 2, then I just try and redress the balance and try and get my life back on track.
So Tris, you said you got really close to Ricky Hatton, obviously. So I'm going to eliminate him from this conversation. I'm going to say outside of Ricky Hatton, who's sort of the easiest person you got to interview out there? Who's the easiest interview that you walk up to and you know this person's going to give you everything you need in an article?
Micky Ward, first guy. And I did a podcast with him at the end of last year. I went up to his home, and it was nearly 20 years to the day from when I first went there and saw him, and he let me into his home to give me my first chance to where we are today, where he brought me in. And I remember I've interviewed him loads of times in the past, spent a lot of time with him in between. And, you know, I remember when he'd just done The Fighter and I'd just become the editor of Boxing News. And I phoned him, I said, wow, you're a big shot, you're in Hollywood. And he said, wow, you're a big shot, you're the editor of Boxing News. I was like, it kind of doesn't really compare, Micky. But because he's helped me so much on the journey, and that he was such a vital part in terms of me getting started, to where, you know, I can go over and we did an interview and chilled out, had some pizza afterwards. Micky's just a lovely guy, and it's a privilege to know him.
Chris, your last parting shot for the boxing lockdown that's obviously produced here in South Africa.
Geez, well, I sure hope we get some fights before too long as everyone stays safe. And I certainly hope that this is an excuse for fighters to take a chance, maybe with their careers, in the fights that they get offered when they come back out of this. I certainly hope that networks and promoters are maybe galvanized to make fights that they wouldn't have otherwise made, now that we've lost basically the first half of this year, at least, if not the first 3/4 of the year. And so that's the dream, and hopefully that can lead to more people working together in the future. If we can mend some fences now in the aftermath of a global pandemic, hopefully it bodes well for boxing's future in terms of people wanting to do business together.
That's just Dixon, the one and only, and I'm going to use the word legendary again because I'm going to make a prediction. Please God, hopefully I'll be buying Mac ticker when he gets his induction to the International Boxing Hall of Fame. From all of us here on the Boxing Lockdown, powered by SA Boxing Talk, we will catch you again soon.